everybody. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we're having the session on Gadigal land, and it's their caretaking of country that's a reminder that true innovation can and arguably must go hand in hand with sustainability, with community, and with a deep connection to the world around us. So I'm delighted to be hosting this conversation today, and I want to echo Dan's sentiment that no one can really bring together such a multidisciplinary conference like Purpose can, and frankly, I'm buying whatever Sally Hill is selling. So as Dan mentioned, I'm Rupal Ismin. I'm the director of the Sydney Knowledge Hub, which is a center at the University of Sydney that supports research commercialization. So my work is really kind of at the heart of what we're going to be talking about today. And my background is as a startup founder and then an operator. And I've been working in the startup world for the last 13 years across Chicago, Sydney, Auckland, and the Bay Area. And my career really reflects kind of the adaptations I've had to make across these different geographies and really economies. And I've been at the University of Sydney now for about 5 years. So just want to kind of give you a bit of kind of context setting for all of us. So before we get started, I wanted to spend a few minutes setting the table for the discussion that Dan and Toby and I will have for the next kind of 40 minutes or so. I want to leave some time for questions as well, so please have them ready. Universities are notorious for using a lot of jargon, so I'm going to say the word research commercialization a handful of times. And so I'd like to define what that means first before I use it probably 10 more times. So research commercialization means developing an invention through research to a point where it can exist and be sustainably funded through the market. Universities are essentially IP factories, and IP is the lifeblood of innovation. But our track record and ability of doing something with that intellectual property here in Australia is pretty low. Us at the University of Sydney we're pretty good at it, but Australia in general is not so great in it. So why do we care? Most of us here, I think, most of us are at this conference today because we sense that the world is at a bit of an inflection point, to say the least. Rates of change are exponentially accelerated. We have big problems around us that I think all of the other sessions have pointed to in one way or another. And these problems are hard problems. They require a multidisciplinary approach. They require a systemic approach. We need our best business minds on it, but we also need our best scientific and engineering minds on it, and we need to bring our scientists and our engineers in on this problem and connect them to the business people around us. And there's, I'm saying this today because there's plenty of opportunity in this space. Lisa Milner mentioned this yesterday, where she wants to invite everyone to kind of, your career can kind of be in this space. So, I want to set this table about kind of just illuminating this area, this underserved area of research commercialization that I think, more people like us can be a part of. Research commercialization, I think, is where the startup sector was about 10 to 12 years ago when I first had my startup. It's getting a bit of attention both nationally and locally, but we're still figuring it out, and there's full of opportunities and excitement. I think all of us here are less interested in kind of the productivity apps that are out there and more interested in the game-changing IP that'll really make a difference. We're interested in the vows that are, set up over in Alexandria over here that are doing lab-grown meat, or the Silos, the psychedelic drug development company, or the Q Controls, which are developing quantum infrastructure software that are really going to change the world. And universities are, I think, central to this conversation in this economy. And as Andrew Walker from Airseed said yesterday, business is the biggest facilitator of change. Me, as an American, really believe in that. And I think a proxy for how good we are at research commercialization is our economic complexity, or as I'd like to think about it, like how realistic is it that my 11-year-old will get a job in Australia when he grows up? Are we just planting things and digging them out of the ground, and we are going through such a rapid economic transition that if we don't take advantage of this intellectual property that's developed on our land, we will be left out and left behind. I was just as preparing for this talk today, I was just looking at our Atlas of Economic Complexity put out by Harvard, and out of 133 countries, there's a list of economic complexity rankings. Australia is 93 out of 133. That's 40 spots lower than Russia. That's 30 spots lower than Eswatini, one of the smallest countries in Africa. It's 10 spots lower than Cambodia, and it's just below Uganda. So that stat, I think, should be a bit of a cause for alarm, because we really do have everything we need here in Australia to really kind of foster this economy. We have an incredibly stable democracy, and I think that, since Trump got elected, oh, look, there's a little huntsman on stage. I don't know if anyone can see that. It's a big huntsman, not a little one.
Biodiversity.
A lot of biodiversity here. We have an incredibly stable democracy, and I really want us to kind of stop and appreciate that for a moment. It feels very safe, and we're very lucky to live in a country like this. We have 3 of the top 20 universities in the world. We are absolutely world-class in our fundamental research. We are uniquely geographically positioned to have both kind of the best and brightest of of Asia, and native-speaking English speakers here. And we have the fortune of educating a lot of them, connecting them with Australia, both for investment purposes and for work opportunities forever. We have a lot of money here. And in the university context, I think we have a duty of care. We are churning out PhD students at higher rates. We have we have a duty of care to kind of give these people that we're educating an area of work that kind of capitalizes on their subject matter expertise. So we have a lot of the fundamentals. How can we do better? And that's what we're going to be talking about today for the next 30 minutes or so. So to kick off the question, I want to talk a little bit about financing. I thought that the panel yesterday at around 11:30 was really, really interesting about new financing models that are more productive and have more of a win-win-win. So, I guess my question is, how do we finance these innovations informed by science, as Vanessa from Samsara put it yesterday? Dan, I might start with you. Traditional venture capital expects a 10x return with a 5-year investment period and a 5-year exit horizon. That timeline doesn't work in a lot of deep tech areas. Can you talk a little bit about kind of, ReGen's time horizon, and maybe as part of that, kind of how you got investors on board, and how much is kind of purpose built into that kind of investment thesis?
Yeah, I guess first of all, we are a traditional venture capital firm that is looking for those outlier returns. Part of our hypothesis is to prove that you can build truly regenerative companies that transform what we eat, how we get around, where we live, what we wear, and to generate companies or build companies that redefine whole systems. And by doing so, our thesis is that will generate superior returns to alternatives, which then creates more scale of capital to do more of that. So that's our thesis, but we acknowledge we are one tool on the tool belt, and that there are many different ways to go about it, and there are plenty of companies that are having huge impacts on the world that don't fit that model, and that there are other pools of capital that can, help those companies either build the scale to fit that type of a model or take a different pathway. So there's very early stage, integrated capital models where you've got grants plus some equity alongside that, as well as we've got venture studios, which Toby can talk about a little bit later, and then different investor types who have slightly different investment time horizons and return profiles. So we are, we didn't think that we'd earned the right yet to innovate on the structure. We first wanted to prove this thesis was a superior investment thesis. Does that mean we will never innovate on the structure? Absolutely not. I think that there are some interesting, permanent holding companies. Obviously, Berkshire Hathaway is probably the best example of that. We want to own a company from the earliest, almost at the point of formation until we die. And there are different vehicles that you can do that within. And I think over time that's evolving. But I would say that there's capital sources for just about every approach, but they're not terribly deep. And I think here in Australia, they're shallower than elsewhere. We don't have things like the IRA in the US or the European equivalent of that. So I think it's something that's still needing to get built out here and is slowly maturing.
Mm-hmm. And was it a tough sell for your first set of investors?
Some are here, we should ask them. I would say people who could see the opportunity and were committed to climate as being one of their North Stars, I think were able to see the opportunity. Plenty haven't. And I think now, with more runs on the board and having demonstrated both our ability to identify great companies and that these companies can be built in a traditional context that is seeking to generate those types of returns and are able to access downstream capital, I think it's evolving. But yeah, it wasn't easy, and I don't think any first fund is easy, and we certainly feel like we're peers with founders. We know how hard it is to fundraise and that you generally get 95 no's for every 100 meetings that you have. It's sort of par for the course. But we like to believe in people before others when we're investing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, within research organizations, we talk a lot about the kind of this valley of death, as we call it, which is kind of essentially where federal funding through the ARC and so forth ends. So grant funding ends, but the technology isn't ready for the private market. And so how do these technologies actually, while they're going up the technology readiness level, how do they actually go up the commercial readiness level when commercially there's not that much funding available for it? So Toby, I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that and maybe your story, both kind of, I think, with Rhizocore, but then also with your experience on the venture studio.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things to unpick in here. I think one thing with the Valley of Death is, can you build business models that are operating the commercial side of things and building that side of things in parallel as you're building the technology out? So for us, we've been very, very conscious from before we even incorporated Rhizocore that we had business deals done and signed, and basically go, if we can produce this, will you buy this? And will you buy this for this price? And I think that's something that most technical deep tech things don't necessarily have to the same degree and extent. And we have the same ramp, so when we're basically selling into trials, our products are being sold into trials at full price so that we know that we can build that in that kind of game. The data is still kind of coming back in at the same time as you're building this, but then we know if the data comes back in, we've already done the trials and we're ready to unlock the big commercial contracts at the point where the data is ready. Not that we've got the data and then you've suddenly got to do a whole bunch of commercial trials after that and then you've got more time before you hit the contract. And so I think some of that's just about being savvy in terms of building things in parallel. And that's something I think investors particularly need to help coach founders through. Because it's not something that would necessarily come naturally to people in the academic kind of space. I think in terms of venture studios and that kind of support that's
Maybe you can start with actually defining a venture studio.
Yeah, okay. There's probably a couple of different ones of them. So the first one I brought up on the slides was Spin Up Science. That's an educational part of a venture building studio. Deep Science Ventures is a venture builder. So they're basically an organization that basically takes talent that is raw, very academic, but does not have the skill set to be able, or the knowledge necessarily to be able to build a company, often don't know the terms, don't know the language that you need to talk with investors and putting that in place. And then you have accelerators, which are basically entities that take fully formed startups that need some coaching in terms of building market fit. If startups gone through the early stage ones, you shouldn't need an accelerator per se, I don't think, because if the builders are doing that right, then they have founders with education. I think also that harks back a little bit to the point that you were talking about before in terms of changing venture models in terms of what that is. I think that's only half of the question. The other half is, how do we train academics from the start one to be able to understand how to build that in the first place? Not once when I was going through PhD programs did I ever have investors come in being like, this is our portfolio, these are the companies, these are the early debts that they built, this is the type of modeling that needs to be done to be able to, like, what is it that takes an academic deep tech thing and turns it into a vastly scalable company? That element of learning is not built into the PhD programs at the start, and that's a huge flaw. And it's why we have to have these kind of accelerated studios and things, because the education is not done right in the first place. And I think there's a large thing to be teaching the people that are going to become founders how to do it in the first place that we miss.
Our whole academic system is really set up for publishing. Right? How do you publish it within good journals, and then how do you move on to the next grant and so forth? And so I think, there's a lot of attention, I think, in the research organizations about the valley of death, but there isn't as much attention brought on to kind of how do we build capacity for our researchers. I mean, and we don't expect our researchers to necessarily be the founders of these companies. I think that's another thing that we need to develop a little bit more. How do we, one, build capacity for our researchers, but how do we build an ecosystem a little bit more so that our serial tech entrepreneurs who want to be more purpose-driven can meet a researcher who has a game-changing technology. Are there other models of this? Are we just talking about kind of venture studios as one model where you have a piece of intellectual property and there is an organization built around that to help kind of think about the commercial readiness and the market validation and so forth, and hire talent to kind of to get that technology out? We have other models like accelerator programs. I don't know if you want to talk to any other models or ways that we can kind of do better in this space.
I can talk about one. We talked about it a little bit before stage. So the venture building studio that I talked about a little bit there, Deep Science Ventures, have got a really interesting approach coming out, which they're basically calling the venture doctorate. And I'm kind of following this space really interestingly. So what they tend to do in terms of their venture building studio is they take post-PhD students, so postdocs, early career researchers, and they give them a year to basically build new IP and new companies that they launch. They've been pretty successful at that, and Rhizocore came off that program. I went through that as well. What they've been basically doing is, can we take what we've learned in terms of the venture building studio and actually make that a PhD program? And so that the scoping in terms of how you're looking at where can we build companies that are interesting happens in year one of the PhD. The proof of concept and the data collection in terms of proving that new technology and that idea works happens in year 2 and 3. And at the end of the PhD, a startup is launched. And I think that's a really interesting way of, can we get that education piece, but also that kind of deep technical thing that are focusing on specific problems into a new way of thinking in terms of the education program, and can we change up that part of the kind of typical tech founder studio to shortcut that, and so that the companies are in better stages, so they don't need to do so much on the pre-seed and seed because they've already got the proof of concept and they're ready to launch in a way that's protected. Those companies then have got a really good cap table and equity story that's coming out. Obviously, that needs to be navigated through the university space, but then you're ready to basically launch straight into commercials in terms of that. And so that kind of de-risks, I think, a lot of that kind of Valley of Death program, because a lot of that first bit before you get to the Valley of Death can be done before a company's even launched. So I'd be really intrigued to see how that goes. But that's one thing that I think is cooking under the scenes.
And what was the financing model for Deep Science Ventures? How was it funded?
So they have a really interesting model. They basically look and go, okay, we think we can build multiple companies in particular areas of interest. So what I was working on was kind of within controlled environment agriculture, but broadly, we're basically asking the question of, can we accelerate plant growth, and what type of companies can we build to do that in that space? They then basically sell that to either a large commercial entity or universities. So in our case, it was the University of Edinburgh that funded that program, that paid my salary for 12 months as basically an entrepreneur in residence. And then basically any companies that came off the end of that, they had a 10% stake in for the sweat equity in terms of that, and then the right to invest as well at the pre-seed round. So that's their model. I think it's still too high on the equity side of things, and something that we really need to understand is what we're doing to companies when they're coming out of universities in terms of equity. I think it's starting to turn around. Historically, it's been awful, which is why there's been a block in terms of getting things that are developed within universities out. But that's how the
process is awful, or the terms?
So when I was working with Spin Up Science, they were doing some piece with the University of Bath at that time, which is a fantastic research university, does some amazing research in the UK. But they just had a standard that every single company that launched out of there, they took 60% equity in that company. So they're company killers before you've even started. And it's about understanding that kind of piece. And like universities around the world often don't understand that. And that kind of point blocks companies' development before they're even launched.
Yeah.
Maybe there's this one other model, because I think Toby raises a good point, which some of the venture builders or venture studios make it really hard to invest in subsequent rounds because of the ownership structure. As a venture investor, we want the founders to have as much ownership as possible, and when they've been diluted 30, 40%, but because they've been incubated in one of these places, it can be really hard to get there. In the US, we've seen this fellowship model be really successfully executed on in the last couple of years. One is called Activate, very technical founders that they bring together every quarter in person and run programs for. We've just invested in a company through that that came from the University of Washington. There's the Breakthrough Energy Fellows, which is another one. It's non-dilutive, sort of $500,000 of funding. And finally, there's one called Third Derivative from the Rocky Mountain Institute. So there's quite a few programs like that where maybe, Toby, rather than going through a venture studio that took equity, could have worked on a program and coming out of that, then go raise some money, having proven the science and maybe found a co-founder. I haven't seen that here yet. I know StartMate runs their fellowship. It's really around sort of talent migration. It's not necessarily around company formation. But I think that would be an interesting thing to explore here. Hi, Sal.
It's interesting because, we need more kind of business acumen within research organizations to unlock the IP. At the same time, I think we're all pretty happy that the academic world isn't full of business people. So a bit of a catch-22, and I think that, that's why it's so important that kind of these bridging organizations or the bridging ecosystems like the accelerator programs and so forth can really develop those ecosystems and do bring visibility to this IP. So, I guess speaking of where do you find this IP? So can you tell us, Dan, a little bit about how ReGen has found some of, how do you develop your pipeline? As I understand it, most of your portfolio companies are overseas. So tell us a little bit about where you go to.
Yeah, there's really 4 areas where we've been identifying interesting companies. One is the universities and these very early fellowship programs. And it was only when we were talking to Rupal last week that I realized 6 of our companies are university spin-outs. So one from MIT, one from Harvard, one from Cambridge, University of Edinburgh, University of Washington now. So we're starting to see quite interesting opportunities there. The second is these accelerator and incubator programs. The third is other funds. We're hyper collaborative. We feel like there are so many problems that need to be solved and so much opportunity that we're very happy to share openly with other funds, things that might suit their thesis better than ours. And then the fourth is sort of our own network. So we have a technical and scientific advisory board. Some of them are on these university campuses in labs or sort of luminaries in the space. One of them is the founder of the nonprofit that Toby was speaking to earlier around mycorrhizal research. So they're kind of like the main areas where we're identifying companies, and we're looking at companies from Estonia to South Africa to US, India, and really wanting to find those companies that we think have the most disruptive breakthrough technology that can scale the fastest and be applicable everywhere around the world. Not kind of the Australian version of Uber or something.
And so how come you don't have any Australian companies there? Is it just because your relationships are deeper elsewhere? You're based in Byron Bay. Tell us a little bit about, perhaps you can do it in terms of a call to action. How can we do better? Our Australian research organizations and ecosystem, what can we do to get ReGen's attention?
I think there's incredible, you name the stats, right? Like the research here is top 10 in the world. So I think it's beginning to occur. You've got CSIRO, we've got Main Sequence doing their work, we've got Cicada, which is somewhere nearby here, incubating a lot of companies there. So I think we're on the path, but the streamlined nature of the capital markets in those different regions is just so much more sophisticated. And, to the point at Stanford where you'll have the PhD program integrating with the MBA programs, you'll meet co-founders there and they'll spin out a company. And so they're just a little bit more intentional and probably a bit more sophisticated in that. But I think here, we are actively looking. There are some incredible companies here, like Vow, who you mentioned, Loan Bio. Those two, we were not quite ready to invest at the time, but we love both of them and wish that we could have. And there's a whole bunch of others coming through different programs, StartMate's climate program at the moment, and then other people here who are building the ecosystem. So I think it's only a matter of time, but we're just a smaller market, so I think it's quite natural that there's more innovation in this space overseas, and the tailwinds at the government level, like it's hard to ignore the IRA and what Europe are doing. It just means that you have companies that can access tens of millions of dollars of non-dilutive funding to build a first-of-a-kind facility without burning equity dollars, and it just makes those companies much more attractive to invest in.
Yeah.
But maybe you should tell the story of Silo, maybe around a story of...
How they found each other?
Yeah.
Yeah, so my husband is the CEO of a drug development company called Silo, and he is a serial tech entrepreneur. So he started a lot of different companies and has brought some companies to Australia. And his background was in kind of the media space, right? And so he was just kind of pigeonholed with launching media companies. And he's like, I don't fucking want to do media anymore. I want to get out of this. I want to do something better. I want to, do more with my skill set. And so I suggested, it was around the time that I got my job, and my job is very much about kind of making these worlds collide. And so I was like, hang around the universities. And so he, came home one day and was like, I want to start a psychedelics company. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? And so he networked within, I helped him network within UNSW and UTS and a few other organizations and Sydney University. And he just by kind of, kismet, met his co-founder, who is Sam Bannister. My husband's name is Josh Ismin. Sam Bannister is this, savant of a medicinal chemist working at the University of Sydney, was getting frustrated by the speed and other challenges that the academic sector faces, and was just itching to kind of do something more. And so just the timing in terms of like Sam and Josh's contract, Sam's contract, align, and it was just this beauty. And they went into, through the StartMate program, which gave them a lot of visibility to kind of a new audience, because Josh is quite connected with the venture capital audience, but a lot of visibility. And it's a match made in heaven, and I'm really hoping that I can figure out, or maybe with your input actually, or other people's ideas around how do we get more people who are very tech savvy, who know how to launch businesses, who are not necessarily kind of still people who are still kind of at their prime, 30, 40, 50-year-olds who have technology at the kind of heart of their work, that can go and meet researchers with amazing IP, and together that team can take things forward. I think a lot of that right now relies on kismet instead of actually kind of structured support. And we're seeing things like the StartMate Blackbird's program, Blackbird's venture capital's programs that are kind of turning out more, I think, armies of workers, which is fantastic. And I think, particularly in the climate tech space, we will need armies of workers that are nimble and are reskilled to be able to kind of support this area. But how do we actually, just make people meet a little bit more? I don't know if anyone has any ideas around that.
I can just say something about my experience as a PhD student. When you come out of a PhD student program, you've had 3, 4, maybe 5, 6, 7 years if you're in the States of a really shit salary.
Yeah.
And that means that the capability of some of the best brains that we have to be able to spend time thinking about what they've learned and how to make an impact is hugely limited, because they need to go and get a job straight away, because their social situations and their financial situations is really pinched. What Deep Science Ventures model is they don't have any preconceived IP. What they understand is almost every PhD student who comes off the end of a PhD student has been given the training that is requisite to be able to come up with ideas and launch companies. And it takes about 12 months to do that, and that's pretty much a proven problem. All you have to do is give them a really kind of, well, maybe it's not even a half-decent salary, but a salary that supports them for 12 months, where you give them the space to exercise the brain thoughts, to be able to put those ideas together, to network, to speak to those people, to find co-founders, that then allows companies to form. And actually, I think it's more about that kind of side of things in terms of the salary support that we give those brains as they're coming out at the end could be a huge blocker that we're just not thinking about.
I also think there's a silent majority of researchers that have worked so hard to gain academic positions. And so within their work within academia, like you are lucky as hell to get an academic position with the number of educated workforce there is out there. And so you get that position, and all you're working for is tenureship and just to be more and more established within the research organization. So asking researchers, after they've worked so hard their entire life to almost put their career, their academic position on hold, because our research organizations here in Australia don't really facilitate that, taking a pause for a little bit of time. You're asking them to make a very, very difficult choice, and I think structurally we need to do better within our research organizations. The last kind of area of questions that I want to ask you guys before we go to questions from the audience is about kind of your personal life. I think that there's just been, I have been really inspired by a lot of people over the last kind of couple of days, and we talk about kind of whole person and work-life balance and so forth. How realistic is that? So, Toby, I don't know, if maybe we can start with you. Like, how much do you work?
I'm probably going to say something a bit surprising here, but something that for academics probably shouldn't be. At Rhizocore, we run a 4-day working week. And that's really crucial for being able to access the thought and the brain power and unlock the talent of your team, and including the founders. Maybe I probably only work a 4.5-day working week. But the battle that I have in terms of the willpower to be able to give my brain the downtime, that gives it the space to be able to come up and do the strategy stuff that allows us to basically unlock that, but also decrease that tension and pressure that comes, I think, in startups. Personal frictions of what's going to kill startups between your team if you have things. And by taking that time to basically make sure that everybody's got enough downtime to keep all of that kind of like stuff that's going on in the background in their lives ticking over in a way that actually allows them to have downtime at the weekend is critically important. And it's really important, I think, more in terms of the founders. I actually think I met Sir Paul Nurse, and for those of you who don't know, he's the kind of primary researcher who discovered how the cell cycle worked. And he always said his best discoveries always came when he took himself away and he went gliding for a 3-day weekend. He actually forced his students, he used to lock the lab up when they were getting frustrated and not making any discoveries, and he used to lock them out and be like, you're going away for the weekend along. That's when all the best discovery is coming down, because you need to let your brain have the downtime. And all of the academic studies that I've seen that are working in this space that are coming out at the moment, I think one came out of the University of Cambridge last year with like 56 companies, pretty much all point to the fact that productivity increases minorly when you work on a 4-day week, and the social benefits that almost every member of staff that you're going to get is going to be hugely improved. And that means that the productivity and the brain power that you've got available to you goes massively up. And so I think it's something unusual. I think it's something we should be paying attention to. But it's incredibly hard to do, particularly as a founder and coming from spaces where culture in terms of academic, startup, commercial companies don't like the fact that's coming up. Being able to take that and be like, you know what, Friday's my day off. And I know I've got 100 unanswered emails in my inbox, but I'm going to be aggressively willpowered to not look at that inbox is incredibly difficult. I only manage it 50% of the time. But it's a battle that you have to have with your own willpower to be able to unlock that, and it's something we don't pay enough attention to.
Are you the sole founder?
No, so I have a co-founder, David, deep technical founder, who's actually stepped down in terms of his technical role and has taken a much more technical role. And I think that's also something that's quite important to kind of understand in the journey with founders is when they get to a point, because a startup's going to grow massively, and there's going to be points where those founders' skill sets, you're pulling them away from what they're really good at. And so understanding and being able to make sure that you get technical people, being able to do technical stuff and not managerial load is critically important. And so I think understanding there's going to be fluidity in terms of the top teams and making sure that that's done where you retain that talent is something that, again, we need to think about. But yeah, David's been fantastic, and he's one of those brains that makes the entity work. He's our chief mycologist, was chief mycologist, now head of mycology. We wouldn't be here without him, and he's still with us in terms of that capacity, but he's not running the business as a co-founder would at this point. So yeah, Rhizocore's had a co-founder, and now I'm running that with other support in the C-level, with COOs and other people in the team that are helping to support that. But yeah, that's our
So you must have a pretty supportive board if you have one, or investors.
Yeah, hugely. I mean, Dan is tantamount to this, and I think you can see Dan might say more about the journey. You're more than happy to say anything about that.
I don't know how he does a 4-day week when all our board meetings are on Fridays.
He's lying.
I'm confused.
What about you, Dan?
I'm always working because it feels like play to me. Like it feels like what we get to do is the greatest privilege, and it's like the total integration of who I am, how our family wants to live, and I think it goes to sort of why start something new. And I think selfishly, I asked 2 questions. That was, what do I want to spend the rest of my life doing, and with whom? And I feel like we've built that, and we get to meet people like Toby and other founders every day who alter our understanding of what's possible. And so I'm always thinking about, the next thing, or how we might, think about scaling, which founder I want to, go and spend more time with, what more we can be doing to support. And so sometimes that doesn't look like work. It might be walking and listening to a podcast, but like it's ticking away. The only time I'm not is when you go for a surf, and not when you're paddling around because you're still thinking then, but when you actually ride a wave, nothing can enter your brain except what's happening right in front of you, and I call that no mind state.
Mm-hmm. So Toby, is that what you mean? You actually like 4 days at your computer, and then the other days are kind of thinking about your work?
Any problem, and it's not necessarily work, any problem that you're grappling with, when you have time where you give your brain time to relax and be in that state, whether that's through doing something outdoors, like surfing, or an activity, whether you're running, where you're not actively kind of at a task or a screen working on something, you're giving your brain that subconscious time to work on those problems and start making those connections behind the scenes. And I think that's important in terms of your brain will always be working on your problems, whatever you're doing, but it will only get there in the speed that you want it to if you give it time to work. And you need to, in the same way that if you have like a piece of equipment, you need to give it maintenance. You have to give your brain the same amount of maintenance if you want it to perform at its top capacity.
I think I was talking to Desiree backstage about kind of the culture of the Australian startup ecosystem versus kind of the Silicon Valley startup ecosystem. And I feel like here it is quite whole person driven, quite work-life balance driven, values driven. And it's great to see. I don't know if it's just like decidedly not American, or we've learned some of the lessons that we see coming from Silicon Valley. So I feel kind of privileged to be part of this startup ecosystem. So we have about 10 minutes. Does anyone have any questions from the audience?
This has been absolutely terrific, and thank you so much. This is probably a highlight for me. I couldn't agree with you more, Dan. It's like finding a tribe. Myself and my agency work in the charity and philanthropy sector, and often I'm quite stunned actually how modest many of the causes I work with and the funds that they're seeking. And Rupal, you mentioned this earlier, that one of the things about Australia is that there's a lot of wealth here. My question is about actually activating and inspiring the wealth that does exist amongst extremely wealthy people in Australia and moderately wealthy people in Australia to start taking a risk and to actually start to either donate philanthropically or actually invest in impact to actually scale along the lines of what we're talking about right now. How do you do that?
I'd like to kind of almost just draw attention to the pin that I'm wearing here, which is a pin that is from giving what you can. which is a nonprofit, and I've pledged to donate 10% of my income to charity forever. This cause is very much about kind of, no matter who you are, no matter how much money that you make, you can give. And, I have almost been like paralyzed by what is the best cause, how do I get involved, for about a decade. And so I actually didn't give. I'd give to kind of the run here or there, but I really didn't give. And I've just been so disappointed with myself probably since I've started to earn money. And so I took this pledge 2 years ago and just set up some auto payments, and look, they might not be the 100% best, most values aligned or areas, but it's forced me to do something. So I think, I'd like to almost like put it to everyone here, what is that commitment you can give to giving? I think that most of my peers actually don't think about nonprofit. They have most of my peers have very purpose-driven work. But they don't think about philanthropy, and I think we should think about that a little bit more. The other thing that I want to say is that within the university ecosystem, at least, I think that intellectual property universities, we should do a better job of communicating what we're seeking funding for. When I do meet donors at the University of Sydney, and I can bring them along with the story, that sell is much easier. So I think it's a communication imperative that us, the people who want philanthropic funding, need to do a better job of. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
Yeah, you just hit on something then. I think storytelling is one of the key components. But yeah, I think it's a valid point, and I would just say, from my perspective, it is starting to flow. There are some very sophisticated, pioneering families and wealth holders that are doing this across generations and integrating philanthropy with impact investing, with traditional investing, and over time almost doing away with quote-unquote conventional or traditional investing and doing everything through an impact or climate lens. And I think we want to prove that that's just better investing. One, I think most of us here acknowledge that it's just better business. Companies like Patagonia and others that have blazed this trail for 5 decades now have proven that, I think, pretty solidly. But now it's like, what are the other mechanisms in order to shift that capital? And I think telling those stories in a more compelling way, and rather than the sort of fear-mongering and what can be like, the world's pretty screwed, but hey, there's hope there. And like, rather than sacrifice our way to sustainability, like, let's invest in things that make life more awesome and solve that problem at the same time.
That's actually a good point. Maybe that's one of our issues, is that, Sherzies was talking about earlier about how we don't put our wealth in our houses anymore because no one can afford houses. We put it in investing through other assets. And so perhaps people of our age, I don't know, our age, as I'm assuming that we're all the same age, are thinking a little bit more about how can they invest more in causes versus philanthropy. And I think there's, of course, a spot for both of those things. There's a question over here.
Thank you. A question for Dan. Interested in how...
Dave.
It is. How you and your team interrogate and understand like startups like Toby's that are working in these like incredibly complex areas, and with all the different countries that you're talking about as well. Interested in that that sort of process to understand that.
Yeah. So it's a great idea to start a global investment firm until you start to actually execute it, and to do things that are incredibly technical and science-driven. But it's really been a process of building concentric circles, core team, strategic advisory board, and science and technical advisors, and having access to people way smarter than us who can validate or not different technologies. We've been very intentional in not having scientists or technical people on our team because we feel like that can sometimes come with bias. And whereas we want to own the decision-making process but be informed by those experts. So, constantly seeking out other people's perspectives and opinions, who are working in these domains that can inform us, and then we can make a better decision based on that. So Toby specifically, we actually met Toby because we were looking at another company based in the US doing a similar thing but with a slightly different go-to-market strategy. And that was a spin out of this nonprofit called SPUN, which stands for the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks. And so they're mapping all of the fungal biodiversity globally, basically everything below ground that we know absolutely nothing about, and building these maps of how that fungal biodiversity interacts with each other. And they're the ones that published the article that Toby referenced, around 13 or 14 gigatons of carbon going through these ecosystems every year. And so we were able to find people who are, top 5 researchers in the world in that space, and to be able to understand the science behind it and then form our own judgment on whether or not that could be a scalable business model, and then go to the other end of the spectrum and talk to customers, whether that's in forestry or in reforestation projects, and say, like, look, if we could give you a product like this that would reduce the mortality rate by X% and increase the tree growth rate and potentially ultimately sequester more carbon and improve biodiversity, would you buy that? And so validate the commercial side. But every company's slightly different, and we're learning and growing as we're going through that process. That's part of the joy, to be honest, like going super deep in some of these spaces. And we do it both top down, like thesis driven, where we'll go into a certain area and say, like, we want to learn everything about this area and meet every possible company that we can. And then sometimes it's bottom up, where someone comes in and tells us about their idea that just fundamentally changes our perspective on something, and we go, that's kind of interesting.
I have a bit of a follow-on question from that. Working in regenerative technologies, how do you think about or design for unintended consequences?
Do you want me to take that? The first question we ask when we look at a company is this regenerative? That's the first screening question, and if it doesn't hit that criteria, we won't go further. Are there second, third, fourth order consequences that may come out of that particular business model that could have harm? And we're asking ourselves that question the entire way through the process. That could be displacing smallholder farmers. That could be focusing too much on carbon to the detriment of biodiversity. There's a whole range of different, I think, unintended consequences that come out of that. Generally, like, if they're obvious, we won't be willing to take that risk. Will there be some companies that we invest in that 10 years from now, there's some unintended consequence that, we're not entirely proud of? I'm sure that will probably happen. But I think the biggest signal to us is the founder and their intention. You can get that indication pretty quickly in the due diligence process, but if this is their life's work, Toby cares so much about ecology, like, he's not going to do anything that's going to go and harm that plant back there, right? Or anything in the world. And so I think that gives us comfort that we're proud to be in partnership with people like Toby, regardless of what those things are, because we're comfortable taking that risk. Whereas I think other founders might be more short-term oriented, or maybe don't understand, those unintended consequences that could emerge.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because with Toby, your background, you've kind of seen a lot of this area. You're not coming from kind of the solution, one particular solution that you found. Like, clearly your heart is in regeneration and in rhizomes in general.
Yeah, I think with Rhizocore and the mycorrhizal space, is really interesting when you look at the kind of graveyard of companies that have come before us. Most of them are all in the grave because they don't have the sensitivity around the environment or biodiversity that are there. Most mycorrhizal companies have gone, hey, we've got this one strain that we've got a bunch of data on, says it performs really well, and they're trying to throw it everywhere. It doesn't work in those places, but also it's a huge biosecurity kind of risk in terms of what's going on. And so what we do with Rhizocore, and we make a very conscious decision that we only supply local strains that we collected from local environments. They come back to our lab, so we grow them, but the local strains go back. And we do expensive stuff to make sure that happens in terms of making sure that the genetics is done so that we know that what we put back is what came from that environment in the first place. that's expensive, and it's not necessarily a good commercial decision to make in terms of like how we do that in terms of our process, but it's a critical decision to make in terms of understanding what you're doing and making sure you have the right QC checks in place to make sure that what you're doing in that sector is kind of important and looked after. And that's also where we're building this global repository of fungal organisms, but also if we were just in terms of our commercial interests, like we would focus on the 1 or 2 species that we know have the biggest benefit. We don't do that. We collect as much as that as possible because we have this second intrinsic part of the business that's about impact. But I think if you don't have that and you lose sight of that, then you can get to points where you make the wrong decisions, but you also have to be able to identify things in the process. So we have one specific example where we said no to a strain because we found that this really funky piece of biology, they had this intrinsic bacteria that's part of a symbiont with the fungus that helps it form this association. We couldn't separate the bacteria from the fungal strain without using kind of quite heavy cocktails of antibiotics, and we weren't able to separate them. But that strain is we know it's got really good use in terms of what its value is, but we don't want to basically put something that's gone through a bottleneck where we've used a process where an organism exists, that bacteria still exists within that culture that could go back into the environment where we've basically kind of put it in there. It gave us a bit of an eye-opener as well because it was an incredibly resistant bacteria to pretty much every antibiotic we threw at it. And so sometimes we come across things like that where it's like, okay, there's a commercial use for that, but we're deliberately saying no because we know that there's an unintended consequence that would be detrimental there. But in some part, that's part of the stewardship. As a founder, I'm incredibly conscious in terms of what we have to do there, and that if a hard decision has to be made that would impact the commercial trajectory of the business, but that mitigates a risk that is something else that could come down the line, a hard decision has to be made, and that in that case, the commercial comes second. But I think that's just something you have to be super conscious of.
Mm-hmm. Well, amazing. I mean, it's been fantastic to hear and learn about Rhizocore through this panel, and so thank you for that, Toby. And Dan, thanks for drawing attention that there is a lot of investment and money to be made from regenerative technologies. So Dan, Toby, thank you.
Thanks, Rupal.